Today's account in the book of Ruth, you'll see this in the first verse as we read it here in a minute. It happens during the period that we just came out of. We just came out of the book of Judges. And this story happens during the book of Judges. We don't know exactly when in the book of Judges it happens. We really, there's a lot of commentary on that, and I haven't seen any high degree of certainty by any biblical teachers that know exactly where it falls in the book of Judges, but it's thought that it would have been around chapters 2 and 3, where Ehud is the judge. So that kind of gives you a little time period. There's, what you'll see is that sometimes the Bible doesn't always tell us things, but you'll see secular Jewish history or Hebrew history that's written. And sometimes that fills in the gaps a little bit. And we don't always know with a high degree of confidence how accurate it is all the time, but sometimes it is. And so it's believed that happens around chapters 2 and 3 of the book of Judges. As I was thinking about this, because I actually wrote this lesson a couple weeks ago, and as I was thinking about Judges and Ruth, and one of the thoughts that occurred to me is it's interesting that the book of Ruth, or the story of Ruth, let me put it that way, that the story of Ruth and Naomi isn't in the book of Judges since it happened during that time. But the more I thought about that, I think that's intentional. I think that the writer Samuel really wanted this story to have its own unique place in the Bible, not in another book, because oftentimes we'll see in First, Second Kings, or we saw in some of the other books that we studied, there's really big stories or big events that happen in them, but they're in other books. This one has its own dedicated book, Ruth. That's what it's called. And I don't think that's accidental. It's given its own autonomous place in the Bible, because if you think about the book of Judges, and those of you that were here, we realize how graphic that book is. It's violent. It's in a bad time for the children of Israel. It's constant disobedience, constant God's judgment, which brings judges, and that's why it's called Judges. So this book needs its own special place away from all that, because this story is probably one of the most important stories in the Bible. In other words, if this story doesn't happen the way it happens, and not to say that God couldn't have done it a different way, but this story is the reason why we're in this room today. It all emanates from this book. It's a really wonderful book. So in chapter 1, you see that the first verse says, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled," there's the reference to the book we were just in last week, "that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons." Verse 2. "And the name of this man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they came into the country of Moab and continued there." So right away we're given a time period, and we see the setting. The setting is there's a famine. And we know wherever there is famine, it's dire. These people they lived, you could almost say, hand to mouth. They didn't have the big superstores that we go to. They didn't have imports and exports, that type of thing. They were living off of whatever they grew. Now, there was trade and there was commerce between different cities and countries, not to say there wasn't. In some ways, I would say that a famine was even worse than none of us were old enough to be alive during the Great Depression, but we've read enough about it. I would say it's in some ways worse than that, because in the Great Depression, it wasn't that there was food available. It's just you didn't have the means to buy it. People didn't have jobs. Although, still, the majority of people during the Depression were working, but there was a lot of people unemployed. I wouldn't know if it was maybe 20, 25% maybe in the Great Depression, which is high, mind you, but a famine is something that affects everybody, and there's just no food. So you see this man named Elimelech, who's married, has a wife named Naomi, and 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And he makes a decision to go to the country of Moab. Now, Moab is a pagan city. It's not a city that believes in God. They're pagan. The first thing you find yourself asking here is, you see Elimelech goes to Moab, and the reason he's doing it is because of the famine. But you have to ask yourself, was this decision bathed in prayer? Was it a decision that was impulsive? How much time was involved in making this decision? And listen, I understand as a man that God instills in men to provide for our family. Now, the culture today wants to mix that up a little bit, but God's way is that the man provides for his family. That's God's way, and we want to find every other way to do things in our world today that's not God's way. But Elimelech understood his role and that he was to provide for his family, so I'm sympathetic to the decision that he had to make. But it seems here that he's running from his problems. He's just going to leave. And we find out later it probably was not the best decision for him in hindsight. And I have witnessed this. You probably have too, where people get into stressful situations or things in their life don't go the way they want it. And sometimes it really is bad, but sometimes it's not as bad as they think, or they don't have the patience to wait it out, and they make impulsive decisions. And we are all old enough in this room to see or have witnessed people that have made decisions like this. And we all know that sometimes running from your problems is not the best idea. Now, we do know that later on, we kind of see this later, even some in this chapter, at the end of chapter 1, that it wasn't a mass exodus of people leaving Bethlehem, Judah for Moab. I'm sure there were other people besides Elimelech and his family, but the Bible doesn't give us any indication that this is like part of a massive group that's leaving and going. So this was a decision that he made for his family. And you notice that it says, I don't know how your Bible says it, but in verse 1, it says that a certain man of Bethlehem, Judea, went to sojourn. How does yours say that? Sojourn? Okay. And so what we need to understand about that word is that the word sojourn indicates that he's going there temporarily. He's not going there to live permanently. He's going there to stay there to wait out the famine. That was the original intention. But if you notice at the end of verse 2, it says, but they came into the country of Moab, and what does it say after that? They what? Remained or continued there. That's right. So the intention was to just go there for a little while, but that's not the way it turns out. And we've all been in situations like that where we have intentions, but the intentions don't always work out the way we think. So in verse 3, it says, and Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left and her 2 sons. Okay, so what we don't know here, the Bible doesn't give us a real big time frame as far as like how long they had been in Moab before her husband dies. But as we read, I think you kind of get the impression that it's been like 9 or so years. Because you're going to see in the next verse, we get a 10-year, well, in verse 4, we'll see where it's mentioned about 10 years. So, and I'm going to explain why I think that is. So in verse 4 it says, and they, that's Elimelech's 2 sons, which is Malion and Chilion, took them wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. And they dwelled there about 10 years. So, like I said, the intention was to come and just stay for a little while, but now they've kind of gotten settled in there. I kind of understand that. When Tommy and I came up here because of my job situation, it was, the original thought was, well, we'll come up here and then when I retire, go back. But now I'm like, I kind of like it up here.
You put roots down.
You do. Yes, exactly right. And now, in my case, I don't have sons that are the age of Elimelech's sons, and we don't know what their age is, but my guesstimation, just the way the story is worded, I get the impression that perhaps they're maybe 8 to 10 years old when they move, something like that. Maybe older, I don't know, they may have been teenagers. But either way, I think some of the more formative years of their life happen to be in Moab. And there you see they've probably made friends, they've gotten to know people, and apparently they got to know a couple of young ladies that they kind of took a liking to. So we see here that they each married, and we see one was named Orpah, and the other was named Ruth. Now, I don't think they were married very long. I don't think they are at all, and I'll explain that to you here. It says in verse 5, and Malion and Chilion died, also both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. So, excuse me. The reason I get the impression they hadn't been married long is that you don't see in verse 5, or in verse 5 it says, Malion and Chilion died also, both of them, and the woman was left of her 2 sons and her husband. Okay, so what you don't see any mention of is any grandchildren. And I think that gives us some insight into how long these two had been married. Let's remember that in that day and time, the only form of birth control that actually worked was abstinence. And by the way, it's still 100% today. It still works. Yeah. I know the world doesn't believe that, but abstinence is the best form of birth control. But that's not a popular thing in our culture today. So my point is this. Had they been married any length of time, I think one of them would have been pregnant. And we know that at least one of them is not barren, because we're going to find out later on with her, she ends up having children, which are very important children, which is the reason we're in this room today. So I get the impression they're newlyweds. So it appears, again, we don't know with 100% certainty that this all happens within a short period of time, but the impression is given to me from the writer that Naomi loses her husband and her 2 sons in a very short period of time. And even if you want to say that you don't believe that, if she lost him within a few years, that's still tough to lose your husband and your 2 sons. For all practical purposes, that is her family. That's all she has. So now she's in a place where she is a stranger for most part. And now, had she gotten to know some people in Moab? I'm sure she had. But everything that she knew was in Bethlehem. So she has no support system. She has no husband. She doesn't have her sons. And what a place that would be. Do you not find yourself feeling for her a little bit? Now, well, again, there's a lot of questions that you find yourself asking as you read this account. One of them you can't help but wonder is, what happened to her husband? What happened to her sons? We're not given any details as to why they died. But apparently all 3 of them died young before they should have. And we don't know if it was accidents. We don't know if it's genetic issue. We have no idea. The Bible doesn't give us those details. One could ask, and rightly so, was God judging Elimelech for a bad decision? It's conjecture, it's subjective, I don't know. Also, you could also say this too. It was forbidden for Jewish people to marry a Moabite. They were pagans. You were not allowed to marry them. They were cursed people. You were not to marry them. So here we see the setting is that Naomi is in a very precarious situation. She's lost her husband, both her sons, and what does she do? It's decision time. So in verse 6, it appears, again, we don't have a time period here, but it appears from the way it's written that she makes a decision pretty quickly. And in verse 6 it says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab how the Lord had visited his people and were giving them bread. So there was a road between Moab and Bethlehem. It was a journey, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what the distance is. But there was probably commerce, and there was people that came back and forth between there. And so through the news that came from Bethlehem, she finds out that God has delivered the people there and provided for them. There's no longer a famine in Bethlehem, Judah. And so the decision is that she's going to return back to where she came from. And you notice what it says there in the beginning of verse 6. What's it say in that first sentence? Who went with her? She arose with who?
Daughters-in-law.
Her daughters-in-law, that she might return. So everything we see here indicates the two daughter-in-laws were planning to go back with her, which is really amazing when you think about it. It tells you something about the relationship between these three women. They obviously loved it. It doesn't seem like there's any hesitation. You don't see Ruth begging them to go, and we'll see this in a minute, some more conversation about this. Or you don't see Naomi begging them to go. It's just an automatic, an assumption that they're going to go with their mom. And let's just be honest, all three of these ladies have been through something. Naomi's been through more than the daughter-in-law. She's lost her husband and both her sons. But these two young women have also lost both their mates. It's a life-impacting event that happened for all three of them. So in verse 7, it says that Naomi went forth out of the place where she was, and her two daughter-in-laws with her, and they went on the way to return into the land of Judah. So it shows here that they're on the trip. They're actually going back, or well, not for them, they're not going back. They're going to probably somewhere they've never been before. Naomi's going back, but they're going to go with their mother-in-law. How far did they travel here before we get here to this next few verses? I don't know. This is again where sometimes I mentioned to you that some of the Jewish history or books that kind of give us a little bit of background to kind of fill in gaps. Some tell us that they believe that Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah walked about 4 miles outside the city of Moab. And I think that sounds about right, only because it says they went on their way. You notice that in verse 7, they went on their way to return. I don't think that means they started for 5 minutes and then stopped. I think that means they had walked for a while. And 4 miles is pretty decent. That's a pretty good little walk if you're walking for ladies. And I'll give you a little bit more detail about that in a minute. So, while they're walking, Naomi's thinking. And again, that's why I say that in verse 6, it seems like it's a real quick decision. They have the funerals or whatever for the two sons, and then shortly after that, Naomi decides she's going to go back. But now while they're walking, Naomi's starting to think about things. And she maybe had not thought it all out after the funerals of her two sons. And now she's walking back with her, got one daughter here, one daughter-in-law here, one here, and she's walking back with them, and she's having these thoughts she hadn't thought before. And as she's walking, she begins to vocalize her thoughts. And by the way, there's no doubt she's touched by their company. It means a lot to her that both her daughter-in-laws are walking back with her. But then she says in verse 8, as she's walking, she says to her daughter-in-laws, wait a minute. Y'all go return to your mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. Now, there's no doubt that there's some love between these women. The two daughter-in-laws are more than willing to go, and she loves them for it. But she understands as she's walking, she's thinking, this is kind of selfish of me to take my two daughter-in-laws who are going somewhere they've probably never been, back to a country that is going to be very different from the one they've been raised in. The culture's different, everything's different. And so, you can also add to that, she's taking them away from their families. I don't know how much of their families would have still been living, but you could assume possibly their parents or siblings, but even more than that, just everything they knew. When you move from one place to another, even for us, just coming from 4 hours up to here was different. There's some things that are actually different just 4 hours from where we came. She also knew that if she took her daughter-in-laws, they couldn't marry unless they converted to Judaism, that is. So they would be single women. So in verse 9, she continues that now remember, this is on a road. They're on a road having this conversation. They've been walking. Maybe they pull off to the side of the road. They're standing there. Maybe there's a rest area. I don't know. But they're sojourning. They're traveling. They're making a trip. And she says, "The Lord grant you that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voice and wept. Can you picture this? They're standing on a road. There's probably other people walking by. This is probably a road that's somewhat well traveled, from maybe donkeys and mules and people walking. So there's other people. I don't think they're probably out there by themselves. And in the middle of this, Naomi's having this conversation with her daughter-in-laws, and then it gets emotional. It just gets emotional. And all three of them are crying, and Naomi kisses her daughter-in-laws. And then verse 10, and the two women, this is Orpah and Ruth, respond to her and say, "Surely we will return with you unto your people." And Naomi said, "Well, turn again, my daughters. Will you go with me? Are there any more sons in my womb, that they may be your husbands? Turn again, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband also tonight, and also should bear sons, would you tarry for them till they were grown? Would you stay for them from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me too much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me." So you could say in verse 10, and immediately Orpah and Ruth are like, no, we're going to go with you. You could say, well, is it obligation? Do they feel obligated to go with their mother? Perhaps they felt bad for their mother-in-law because, yes, she had lost her husband and her two sons. Do they feel some impending reason in their mind, just that out of obligation or duty, that they should do this? But Naomi is persistent. She says, no, you need to go. You need to think this out. And let's just be honest here. These two young ladies, Orpah and Ruth, they are just that. They're probably young. And they may not have completely thought it out. It could have been an impulsive decision on their part to just follow their mother-in-law. And so Naomi's the older, wiser lady here, and she is thinking it out. And so she wants her two daughter-in-laws to make sure that they make a decision that's based on all the information. Don't just think about the pros or you being with me. You need to think this out. Like this, what you're doing right here is going to impact your life. And so she even mentions, are you going to wait for me to have more sons? Which would mean they'd be marrying somebody a lot younger than them. Mm-hmm. But she just is trying to get them to think. And I think also she wants them to make the decision based on honesty. Have all the information, which is very smart.
Well, if you think about it, and they would not, number one, they're traveling alone as women. They don't have anybody else. But Naomi doesn't say, hey, I've got a big family, maybe there'll be somebody that you could marry. There's no comment about, they basically know if they're going, they're just going to have to figure out life just them. Because there seems to be no forethought on Naomi's part that there might be a kinsman redeemer or whatever that we find out later.
Yeah.
But none of that's discussed. So basically, it's like, well, you're just going back and you're gonna be stuck with me. So
I appreciate her though giving this information to her daughter-in-laws. Yeah. I think it's very wise of her. You notice that she says at the end of verse 13, she tells them, are you going to wait on me to have sons? And then she says, for it grieves me much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord is gone out against me. What do you think that means?
So it's put her in that situation.
Okay.
No men, and
okay.
I feel like there was a reason behind that.
Right. Okay. Pam?
And just that God had betrayed, taking everything from her.
Okay. And I wondered on that. When I read that statement a couple weeks ago, I just wrote down a couple things. I think that it would be easy to have that thought. If you've lost your husband and your two sons, you could see why she would make a statement like that. I also wonder this. This is just throwing this out there. I'm not saying this is true. I don't know. I'm just wondering out loud because, again, there's so much in this passage that leaves you wondering. For me it does, because I'm just that inquisitive person that really wishes I had more details at times. I wonder when she says the Lord has gone out against me, could it be that Naomi was complicit in the decision to leave Bethlehem? Could she have possibly influenced her husband Elimelech to leave? It could be a lot of things. Maybe she was just like, he mentioned it and she's like, sure, let's do it. I'm the supporter. Or maybe it could have been more. Maybe she's like, hey man, things are rough here. Maybe she prodded her husband. There have been times in my marriage where Tommy has been there in that way, but mostly she's a really good supporter. 99% of the time, Tommy's just, whatever I think is the best decision, that's what we'll do. Now, there are times where Tommy does put her foot down, so don't think she's not that, but she's a little fireball. But I think we do pretty good, the two of us, making decisions together for the most part. But when it comes to a lot of major decisions, she kind of leaves that role up to me. And I'm not going to say that I've always made the best decisions, by the way. I can identify with Elimelech because I've made some bad decisions in our marriage, for sure. But I wondered, in my mind, did she feel like that she might have had some involvement or complicity in this decision to leave Bethlehem? I don't think she's blaming God here. That is for certain. And we'll see this again in a little bit. If anything, I think she's indicting herself. She feels like she might be part of the blame for why this is happening. Either way, in verse 14, as they're standing out on this road, they've had this conversation. Again, they lifted up their voice and wept. Well, this is quite a scene out here on this road. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clave or clung unto her. Does yours say that any different? Clung to her. What an emotional scene we have here. Did I miss something funny here? No. Languages.
I'm not going to do that to my mother-in-law.
Oh, you're not going to clung? You're not going to clung to your mother-in-law?
I don't know.
Well, yeah.
Well, I just thought of something when you were talking about, like, the verse before where it says the Lord's hand has gone out against me. I mean, if she had tried to sit down and explain, well, we moved here, we came to Moab, my son's married Moabites, we're supposed to, then that's just also almost a slap in the face to the daughter-in-laws. I mean, they chose to stay there. They chose to remain in Moab instead of going back. And so they would almost have to have accepted that way of life, including the daughter-in-laws. It's not like she's going to say, well, you're Moabites, and we weren't supposed to do this. Now they're family. And
But she does. I don't know how yours translates, but over here, like verse 20, she says, because Shaddai has made my life bitter. El Shaddai is specifically like the Most High. So to her, it's kind of like, he's putting me down in the dirt. And there's a reason, and I know this reason.
Oh,
Yes.
And I'm not going to say it's you, but
yeah.
it's you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you on that, Pat. I agree with that 100%. But again, I want to reassert, I don't think she's blaming God.
No, she's not blaming God. She knows what she has done because she keeps saying Shaddai has afflicted me.
Right.
Right. And giving God honors there. He's still got the very much honor.
Maybe she's also concerned that it could happen to their daughters-in-laws too. When she's around them, my husband died, my 2 kids died. Like, I want to say she's bad luck. I don't think it's a bad luck.
Yeah.
Brings bad luck, not that way. But maybe she's worried that she may carry that on to their daughters, and then
Interesting thought. Yeah.
Yeah. That could
Yeah.
happen to them
You stay with
too.
me, this could be your fate as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
That's a good thought. I actually like that a lot. Yeah. That's interesting.
And then you think, did it ever occur to the daughters or daughter-in-laws? I mean,
Yeah.
like
That's true.
Yeah,
She's wanting them to think this out, isn't she?
yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting, Norma. I hadn't thought of it that way.
It's also interesting that I feel like the context is very different. Like, for instance, if anything happened to a husband, like, we can survive by ourselves. We'll be okay. I wouldn't be spending the time to be thinking about, I have to remarry, what I'm going to do. I'll probably just prioritize my kids. Like, we'll be okay.
And
Not saying but
You
like,
might be
not to
mistaken.
worry,
Yeah, but everything that
It's
he
so
has would come to
different.
you more than likely.
Yeah.
And in this situation, nothing.
They have nothing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nothing
Yeah.
came to them.
They really, yeah. That's a great point.
Surprise, you got
Let's-
Yep, Jeff, that's exactly right.
Yeah, or maybe like you also.
Yeah.
So back to this road here that we're on. These ladies, it's an emotional. When you read these verses, you sometimes lose context of the time. I don't think this is we can read this in 30 seconds. It's a lot longer than that. They're standing on this road here for an extended period of time. I think there might even be some conversation that's not included from the writer between these women. Not trying to say anything about ladies and how long it can be. I'm not making any insinuations there. But I'm just saying that this is a very emotional conversation. There's a lot of tears. The mascara is all messed up. You know, there's a lot going on here. Okay. So at the end of this, though, because this is not a light conversation, the choices that are being made here are lifetime decisions. This is really important stuff here that's being made very quickly. Have you ever been in a spot where you had to make a decision very quickly and it impacted your whole life? That's how I ended up here. It was a phone call, and I had to make a decision in yes or no. So I understand that. So at the end of this verse, in verse 14, we see here that Orpah kisses her mother-in-law, and she goes back to her family. But we see that Ruth does what Maya says she will not do with her mother-in-law, and that's cling to her mother-in-law. But
I'm sorry.
go.
I just think it's interesting. Two daughter-in-law, they make different choices. But same like this is more glorify what Ruth is doing than what the other daughter-in-law. But I don't think there's anything wrong with
Oh
the
no,
daughter-in-law.
I agree,
But
100%.
I'm just saying, why is her story is not? I guess it's
Why-
just
Her
Yeah.
story comes
Yeah.
back up.
completely.
Who? Orpah or Ruth?
Oh, Orpah.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. What?
Supposedly she is from the lineage of Goliath.
Yes, there's some speculation about that. That later on Ruth ends up being the mother of Goliath, and doesn't he have a twin or something like that? But yeah, supposedly, don't really know. I agree with you. This is not. We're not denigrating Orpah here in any way, shape, or form. She's making a decision based on the information that was provided to Naomi, and it makes good sense.
You probably would have been the norm to
Yeah.
go back home
Yeah.
if there was no one else.
I get
there,
it.
because you needed someone to take care of you. You had nothing as a woman then.
The more radical side of this is what we're going to see from Ruth, but it's beautiful.
I would
So-
say also, probably most likely a man wrote this.
Oh, Samuel.
I've heard Samuel. I've heard someone from the lineage of David.
Yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
Either way, Ruth and Naomi weren't writing this.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're that's good insight, Pat.
It'd be a lot longer.
So in verse 15,
Sorry.
yeah, but I agree with you. That's why I said earlier, I think this conversation lasted a lot longer than the verses we're reading here. This is quite a scene on the side of this road here. And in verse 15, so after this, Orpah goes ahead and leaves and kisses her mother-in-law and goes back to her family. And now Naomi says to Ruth, she says, "Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return you after your sister-in-law." And Ruth says to Naomi, and mine says entreat. How does yours say that? Urge me not to leave you or to return from following after you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. Where you die, will I die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and also, if aught but death part you and me. And when she saw that she was steadfastly minded to go with her, she left speaking unto her. How does yours say that bad last part? She said no more? Okay. And she realized it was, fruitless to say anything else to her. These verses are some of the most beautiful verses in the Bible, especially when Ruth says, urge me not to leave. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. I actually have a ring. I wore it for a while, but it got damaged at work, and it wasn't made out of the best material. But Tommy gave me a ring. There was a period in our life where this was back around 99, 2000, where I was really struggling with God's will about what I should be doing. And I felt like I was at a crossroads, so to speak. It was just something simple that led to it. We had sold our house, and it sold quicker than what we expected, and then we couldn't find a house. And somebody, a realtor that was a for sale by owner kind of guy, ended up saying something to me that kind of set me off on a strange path. He's like, "Are you sure you're supposed to be looking for a house?" And he was a Christian guy, and a guy that the Lord had really done a great work in. He had been on drugs, he was a drug addict, and the Lord had done a miraculous work in his life. And he ends up saying that to me, and I felt like it was the Lord bringing him in my life. And so for a while there, we were living in a hotel, so to speak, one of these extended stay hotels for about 10 months. And for that 10-month period, I was struggling with God. Like, what am I supposed to be doing? I didn't know if I was supposed to be going into ministry or if I was supposed to go to the mission field. We explored a lot of different options, but it felt like every door closed and just nothing was giving me peace. And in the end, I ended up staying with UPS, ended up at a different church. I ended up starting to teach adults in a Sunday school class. And in the end, I think God put me through all that stuff to just say, well, really, I don't need you to be, you don't need to be in full-time Christian ministry to be effective. You're a 15-watt bulb, and you've got that kind of influence. So be the 15-watt bulb I need you to be, and that's what I'm doing. You're my 15 watts. You're my influence, and this is what God wants me to do. He wants me to teach. And so we all get to places where we have to make decisions like this, and apparently Ruth made hers, and it's emphatic. She begs her mother-in-law, don't try to convince me. Where you're going, I'm going. And this to me is a beautiful picture of love. And I said all that to say about what I told you this little story about myself, and then I forgot to tell you the reason I was telling you that. Tommy, in the middle of that, bought me a ring that has that inscripted in Hebrew on the inside. Where you go, I will go. And that's why I say my wife's always been a great supporter of mine. Whatever decision you make, I might not always like it, but I'm with you. We're together. And Tommy has been that way. We've been married 35 years, and all 35 years she's been that way. I can't think of a time where she hasn't supported anything that I felt like the Lord was telling me to do. And so I know this is a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, but a lot of romantic relationships have used this verse to say, we will copy this. And I think it's a picture of love. And we know that love is not just a word. Love is action. It's an attribute. We know that love is not what you can get. Love is what you can give. The Bible says, for God so loved the world that he gave. So love is what you can give. And she is demonstrating her love by what she's giving Naomi. She's saying, I am going to be with you. I'm not leaving you. Notice something that's very interesting. Naomi tells Ruth in verse 15, she says to Ruth, hey, notice your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Catch that? Now, notice what Ruth had said. Ruth said, where I will go where you will go. In other words, and then she says, your people shall be my people. So we have Orpah saying she's going back to her people, but Ruth says, no, I'm going to your people. And then Naomi points out to Ruth, hey, your sister-in-law went back to her gods. And Ruth says, no, your God will be my God. Notice, I don't know if your Bible does this, in my Bible, one is capitalized and one is plural. And the other, so gods is in lower G-O-D-S, and it's plural. And in Ruth's case, it's capital G-O-D, and it's singular. So what you see there is that there's a couple things happening. Ruth is telling Naomi, not only am I turning my back on my family, so to speak, which I don't know if that's the best way to put it. It's not that she's turning her back on her family. She's leaving her family. But one thing she is doing is she's turning her back on her gods. She is now acknowledging that the God of Naomi is going to be her God. So what you could say in a way here is this is the conversion of Ruth. This is the equivalent of when we see someone give their life to Christ. This is what Ruth is doing. She's acknowledging that she is going to worship the same God. So,
and it goes on, she says, I never really thought about that, but may the Lord deal with me. Like she'd already even she'd gotten herself to that place spiritually that she was recognizing the Lord.
Well, what's interesting too is that let's just be honest. Let's just be honest here. Ruth hasn't seen much positive about God, the God of Naomi here to this point. Everything that she's seen has been negative. That Naomi loves God, and this God that she says has dealt bitterly with her has taken her husband and her 2 sons, and yet you still see Ruth. So she saw something in Naomi. I think even maybe she saw something in the family when the husband was alive and Elimelech was alive and the 2 sons were alive. She saw something in this family, and she wanted part of it. And that should tell us something, that the way we are around our family or around friends or people we're around, people see the difference in us. And if we're not exhibiting the attributes of what Christianity is, how are they going to come to want to be like this? This woman is willing to leave everything because of the testimony of her mother-in-law. Understand also the permanency of this. She says, I will die where you die. In other words, she's not doing, this is not a temporary thing for her. She knows when she leaves Moab, she's going there for life. She's saying, where you're buried, I will be buried. That's pretty permanent. That's commitment. You know, I heard a preacher one time, I think even Brother David mentioned this, that when you eat breakfast in the morning, if you have eggs and you have milk, you know, you have an investment made by the chicken and an investment made by the cow. But when you have bacon, you have commitment. And so this is commitment. This is a woman that says, I will give everything. And you don't see this in our world today. And in verse 18, we see that Naomi realizes it's not even, she says, I'm not even going to try to argue against her. So in verses 19 through 21, I got to speed this up a little bit. So the 2 went until they came to Bethlehem. And it came to pass when they were come to Bethlehem that all the city was moved about them. And they said, is this Naomi? And she said unto them, call me not Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why then call you me Naomi, seeing the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me? Now, let me go back up to verse 19, where it says the 2 went until they came to Bethlehem. What's not mentioned there is like this is not a 5-minute walk. This is
I'm looking at the map.
yeah, okay. Yeah, so it's approximately probably about, it's somewhere, we don't know from what point they were to what point they went to exactly. At the minimum, it's 25 miles. At the most, it's 50 miles. It's believed it would take between 7 and 10 days to walk that. So they have some time. Oh, I want to add one other thing to that. It's mainly uphill because of the elevation. You're going up to Bethlehem. So they're dealing with that. So it's a pretty good little journey. In this walk, though, we don't know this, but I think we can assume this. In this walk, there's a lot of conversation happening between Naomi and Ruth. And I think that Naomi is filling Ruth in on a lot of things, like, you know, things that she wouldn't know about the culture of Israel, about Jews. She's telling them about the 10 Commandments. The Moabs wouldn't know anything about the 10 Commandments. They might have, but they didn't adhere to them. She's explaining the 10 Commandments. She's explaining, remember now, Naomi is a new convert. Ruth is a new convert. And Naomi is her mentor. And so Naomi is telling her all about the faith, telling her about the diets, the dietary restrictions. We don't eat unclean meat, nothing that's not split between the hooves. There's different feasts that we celebrate every year. There's different sacrifices and other cultural differences. And we see in 2 weeks from now, when we get into chapter 2, we're going to see that there's some other things that she probably told her daughter, her daughter-in-law about. And so this walk that they're having that lasts for at least a week is drawing them a lot closer. They were already close, but now it's just the 2 of them. They're sharing things. There's just a lot of information going back and forth. Now, when they arrive, you see that in verse 19, that all the city was moved about them. How does yours say that? Stirred. Now, Bethlehem is not a big village, okay? But it's decent size, but it's a village no less. It's kind of like when you live in a small city, everybody knows everything, right? You know, that's right. And so here, when she gets back, everybody knows it's her. And it's kind of a big deal. All the city's stirring about it. And you know, there's some things we could assume with that. One, that Naomi and Elimelech were well known. This is where they grew up. And so she's back. And you see them where they ask the question, is this Naomi? Does yours say it that way too? Is this Naomi? Why do you think it says it that way? Is this Naomi?
Been gone for at least 10 years.
And she comes back alone.
That's right. That's true. Yeah. And don't you think too, possibly, I'm just going to throw this in there, it's been a long 10 years. There's been a lot that's happened to this poor woman in 10 years. And 10 years will age you naturally. Just 10 years, you look at the difference between me 10 years ago and today, I look a little different. Okay? But if you add the stress of losing your husband and your 2 sons, that'll age you. And so I partly wondered if maybe she just looks a lot different, and they're wondering, is this Naomi? They think it is, but they're not sure. I don't know. I'm just throwing that in there.
Did you ever see the presidents? One of
Oh,
them?
yes.
Really
Yes.
change.
When
Yeah.
they go into office,
Yeah.
they leave.
Yep.
And that's not even 10
They
years.
use that just for men jail to keep her looking.
Now, one thing that's not mentioned in this chapter, but we're going to see it next week, or not next week, 2 weeks from now. Apparently, when you see it says that all the city was moved about them, and they ask if this is Naomi, there's more to that than what we're reading. Apparently, Naomi takes the time to introduce Ruth to all the people that she's coming, family members and friends and people she's acquaintances she's known. And the story of Ruth and what she has done to leave and what all was involved in that got around. And we're going to find this out in chapter 2. It becomes a really big deal. So you notice at the end in verse 20, she tells them not to call her Naomi, because Naomi means, does anybody know what that means? It means pleasant. Very good. That her name means pleasant. So she says, that's not what you want to call me right now. She wants you to call her Mara. And you notice she makes that statement, I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. That's an interesting statement there. And I can't help but notice the 2 references. She says, I went out empty. The Lord has brought me back. I went out full. The Lord brought me back empty. Again, that kind of gives me some insight that maybe she was complicit in this decision to leave. It feels like she's taking some ownership of this. I went out full. The Lord has sent me back empty. I don't know. I might be making more of that than what maybe I should be. But again, what she is not doing is not condemning the Lord here. What she really is saying is, I'm ready to restore my relationship with God again. That's really what she's saying.
What was the ladies' Christian conference the one time when there was a lady speaking on this, and she was talking about what the atmosphere must have been like for Ruth living with Naomi, because she's like, essentially Naomi's walking around and go, call me bitter. So that's like the life she now gets, is kind of like bitter, and almost, to me, that almost sounds a little scorned. Like,
Yeah, it does.
so that's the environment now that Ruth, she's like, yay, she's pleasant.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you just have to wonder, like, did maybe Ruth question when she said that? Okay, well, I said, because that couldn't have been easy. It was not an easy life. We know it couldn't have been easy.
Yes. Well, 2 more things before we got to get out of here I want to mention. Notice that it says in verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter. That's the first time we see her referred to that. Ruth the Moabitess. And you'll see her referred to that until a very special moment and the next couple chapters. And she gets a new name. And the Bible says that we get a new name when we receive Christ. But even now we are called sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, conquerors, leaders. So that's really interesting. Next week we're going to see a beautiful parallel here. We're going to see that Ruth is representing us. And then we're going to see that we're going to see a man that she meets that represents Jesus. It's really neat. One last thing I want to mention out. You notice at the very end of verse 22, it says they came to Bethlehem in what? The beginning of what? Well, guess what, guys? We're real close to that. We're actually in the time period where this story happens. We're going to get the end of May is where you start to see the barley harvest, and we got barley out not far from where we live. We passed all the fields today. Like you saw the tracks from the sprayers spraying it. So we are actually in the same period of time of this story, and I thought that was kind of neat.
Is this a plug? Is this, hey, I got some barley, y'all.
No, it's not a plug.
What are we for?